I'll go right to the point. Did Alexander Hamilton own slaves? There are those who definitely say yes. There are those who will definitely say no, although those voices are growing quieter. Even Ron Chernow lands on the side of probably. But what are the facts? What do we know for sure? Does it all add up to an airtight case against Hamilton? The even bigger question probably is what that means. Does it mean that any speech that he gave, any philosophy that he held, any vote he cast for abolition is a lie? Does it mean that he was delusional, that he was trying to justify himself for what he knew was unjustifiable? Or does it mean that his detractors are still too determined to paint him as a villain? In his day, it was the Jacksonians and the Jeffersonians who were totally willing to paint him as evil. And today, it might be those that are farther left who really are upset by that multiracial casting the show has, and by extension, view it as a death blow that Hamilton did own slaves. It's a big question, it's a serious one, and it deserves a deep dive. We're gonna walk through the mist of the most uncomfortable part of history and see how that affects how we can understand the smash hit musical Hamilton on this episode of Theater History and Mysteries. I'm John Brushke, and you are listening to Theater History and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. All right, friends, thank you for listening. We are hanging on, but we're not all the way there yet. If you could share, comment, show the algorithm that you would like to have more of this. There are lots of ways that you can connect to history and musicals, but if you want depth and some substance behind your entertainment, it makes it kind of fun along the way. This is kind of a one-of-the-kind show that, frankly, the algorithm doesn't really understand all that well. It doesn't know what genre to stick us in. I'm proud of that, but it does make it harder to get an audience. So if you could help out, it really will make a difference. I thank you so much for taking the time, lending me your cranium for these 40 minutes to an hour every 2 weeks. If you could help out by spreading the word, posting an episode that you like, leaving a rating, that would be super helpful. And if you could check out anything in the back catalog, that would be good. We're going on 40 episodes now. That's, more than 30 hours of content. If you like the Hamilton show and you're interested in other ones, start back all the way at episode 1. There's plenty more there. And just as our last little item of bookkeeping, we are now in episode 5 of the Hamilton series, which will go for at least 12 episodes, maybe a little more or less, depending on that goes. So that's going to get us all the way through next summer. And at that point, we'll pivot to our next show and see what's going to happen next. If you have ideas, go ahead and send it to me at the email, which you can find on the Buzzsprout site or on YouTube. Okay, on to the question. Alexander Hamilton and slavery, what's up? Well, let's very quickly talk about what's in the show. We're not going to dwell on this a lot, but here's a quick summary from Stephen F. Knott. I'm going to introduce him a little more later, but here's what he has to say about the show. The musical has a clearly defined progressive slant portraying the immigrant upstart as an abolitionist and the personification of the hardworking immigrant who gets the job done, end quote. He's anti-slavery, he might be abolitionist, and had he only lived longer, he would have done much more, and we could have perfected this democratic experiment that we're calling America. That's clearly the view you have in the show, and the question, is that accurate? And if the actual history is different than the way it is portrayed in the show, why does that matter? How does that change our understanding of the show? And how does it change our understanding of history? That is what we're going to get to the bottom of in these episodes. So we are going to pursue this question in 3 parts. First of all, we are going to look at the facts on record. Did Alexander Hamilton own slaves? The follow-up question to that is, if, once we find the answer, is that a deal breaker? Does that change what we think about Alexander Hamilton and sort of disqualify him as being a hero, any way you want to look at it? And finally, what were Alexander Hamilton's political positions on slavery? Because one thing that we're going to learn pretty quick is it was not unusual to be both a slave owner and an abolitionist during the Revolutionary War period. And I'm not saying that makes it okay. I'm just saying he might have had other political positions that went beyond simply whether or not his family, his immediate family, were part of the slave owner class. Okay, question number 1. Did he own slaves? Okay, the main source on slave ownership, at least the one that says Hamilton did own slaves, is Jesse Serfilippi. Jesse was working at the Schuyler Mansion Historical Site. There's a publication there in 2022. Now, it is, I will say, serious scholarship, but does not, to me, appear to have been peer-reviewed. So this is something that got published by Jesse Serfilippi on her own, and that's just something to keep in mind as we evaluate the credibility of this, but there's plenty of original source material that Serfilippi cites. And I think Jesse is now at the University of Albany. I've heard LinkedIn profile is all the way up to date. So I think, how would we characterize Jesse as an author? Definitely worked at the Schuyler Mansion Historical Site, definitely had access to source materials, definitely into history. Not clear to me that this was peer-reviewed scholarship. Anyway, that's maybe too much to say, but here is their take. The first biography about Alexander Hamilton was written by John C. Hamilton, his son, and it included 7 volumes. Here's what Serfilippi has to say, quote, Alexander Hamilton never owned a slave, but on the contrary, having heard that a domestic whom he had hired was about to be sold by her master, he immediately purchased her freedom, end quote. And Serfilippi notes that there's no record of the sale, and I probably should have said this earlier, but that was Serfilippi quoting the original John Hamilton biography. Serfilippi thinks that, quote, this variant view of Hamilton has been adopted by nearly every biographer since, end quote, but there was one exception. Back to Serfilippi quoting, one of the few historians to have contested John C. Hamilton's portrayal of Hamilton as an abolitionist, published a book titled The Intimate Life of Alexander Hamilton in 1910. This biographer was none other than Allen McLean Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's grandson and John C. Hamilton's nephew, end quote. So if you are keeping score there, the first person to say Hamilton did not own slaves was his son, and the first person to contest that view was his grandson. But now I think most biographers do acknowledge that it was part of his professional life. Hamilton's professional life at least involved the use of slave trading, either as a lawyer advising people or as a clerk or in somehow facilitating it. And that includes Ron Chernow. So that if it was true that by 1910, nobody had seriously challenged that, it is now true that I think most people do have the belief that Hamilton was somehow involved in the slave trade. And for Serfilippi, she's having none of this. Quote, not only did Alexander Hamilton enslave people, but his involvement in the institution of slavery was essential to his identity, both personally and professionally. The denial and obfuscation of these facts in nearly every major biography written about him over the past 2 centuries has erased the people he enslaved from history. It has also created and perpetuated a false and incomplete picture of Hamilton as a man and founding father, end quote. All right. So most people now accept that there was some involvement for Serfilippi. That is a big deal. So let's get on to the evidence. What is the smoking gun? Of course, Hamilton grew up on the island of St. Croix, Croix, and growing up there, it was very prevalent. The families that he lived with owned slaves, including his mom. His mom and dad were famously never married, but when his mom passed away, her whole estate went to his dad, and that included the slaves. He also had a job there as a clerk where slavery was just part of the business. There was a trading post. The name of the trading post that he worked for was Beekman and Kruger, and they definitely bought and sold slaves, including one especially notorious sale of 300 people that had recently arrived from Africa, and that happened while Hamilton was working there. For Serfilippi, that means he must have been involved. I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption. Now, here's a little note on page 7. This is what Serfilippi says, quote, there is no indication, either in documents from Hamilton's childhood or adulthood, that the horrors of slavery he witnessed on St. Croix turned him into an abolitionist, end quote. And Serfilippi repeats this several times in the article that says Hamilton is no opponent of slavery and is no abolitionist. We'll get back to more on that later. Okay, so first piece of evidence that Hamilton might have been involved in slaving, might have owned slaves, is that as he was growing up on that island of St. Croix before he came to the United States, or I guess back then the American colonies, he both lived in households that had slavery and he worked for a company that was an active participant in the slave trade. Okay, but now he's in America and he becomes prominent, and there are 2 cash books of his that survive. One shows money for medicine that was spent on a woman named Peggy, and that person was presumably enslaved and probably for sale. Serfilippi says like this, quote, Hamilton's record of money spent on medicine for Peggy reveals that Hamilton purchased her at Treat's direction and held her for Treat until he could purchase her from Hamilton. While this may not place Hamilton as in the role of enslaver, it does firmly place him in that of slave trader, end quote. So that is, Hamilton briefly takes legal title in a slave transaction for the purposes of moving that person to somebody else. For Sarah Filippi, that correctly points out that is slave trading. There are similar transactions for John Baker Church, and that is Angelica's husband, and hence is related to Hamilton. And those transactions extend over 2 decades. So the incident of Peggy is especially well documented, but Sarah Filippi Wright points out that there are like scores of these transactions for the next couple decades. There then comes up what is called a tricky situation. The Manumission Committee of New York, we'll talk about what a manumission committee is in a bit, worked to purchase the freedom of enslaved people. That was one of the things that they did. And they interceded to free a woman named Sarah from the Church family. And that was noted that was especially embarrassing for Hamilton. The Manumission Society wanted to find slaves that were in especially bad circumstances and work to free them. Okay, and so Hamilton marries into the Schuyler family, and one of those daughters marries into the Church family. So his in-law is essentially one of the people that is holding an enslaved person that the commission that he is on, the committee that he's on, feels the need to intercede for. Chernow says that there is a, quote, hunch that one of the cash book transactions was a purchase for Hamilton himself and not for the churches. Sarah Filippi reads the evidence as even more damning, saying, quote, yet when Hamilton purchased an enslaved person for a friend or family member, he always recorded who the transaction was carried out for. Hamilton's cash book reveals that the transaction made in 1796 was carried out for himself, end quote. So let's just review how Sarah Filippi got there. The cash book records a purchase, but it does not indicate that purchase was made for somebody else. So, concludes Sarah Filippi, it must be for Hamilton. Sarah Filippi also notes that not every one of Hamilton's transactions are in the book. So, for Sarah Filippi, that means there are probably more. And there's not really an inquiry in whether or not that might mean that this record is also incomplete and not an indication that Hamilton bought Sarah as a slave for his own household. That's the second piece of evidence. The third piece of evidence, as part of his work as a lawyer, he was involved in transactions that involved enslaved people. In Hamilton's own hand, there is some handwriting for a transaction for $10 on behalf of an L. Ogden for, quote, opinion concerning Negroes, end quote. Sarah Filippi believes this to be Lewis Ogden, who on the New York Census shows owner of 3 different slaves. Hamilton is being paid for his legal opinion about some matter involving them. And that's just one example. There are many more, but it does appear to be the case that as part of Hamilton's legal practice, he was giving people advice about how to handle legal matters that involve people that they had enslaved. In 1781, so we're now like the fourth piece here, in the first year of marriage, he wrote to a member of the Clinton family, and that note included the phrase, quote, to pay the value of the woman, end quote, which, in the words of Sarah Filippi, quote, implies Hamilton was paying Clinton for the woman. He did not say he was paying for the value of her labor, as other historians have argued. Hamilton was exchanging money for the woman herself, end quote. Okay, so that is the fourth piece of evidence. There is exchange, the phrase of to pay the value of the woman. And others have interpreted that to mean he is compensating for work being completed. And for Sarah Filippi, that is a smoking gun that says he's actually purchasing the person. There's also a discussion in Sarah Filippi's paper of how many terms Hamilton used that made it hard to pinpoint whether someone was a slave. For instance, in many cases, people who were slaves were referred to as servants, although Sarah Filippi is careful to note that is more the case of the Schuyler's nomenclature than it is of Hamilton himself. And there are a bunch of specific examples to that in the text. There is also a cash book entry where Hamilton records a payment of $250 to Philip Schuyler for, quote, 2 Negro servants purchased by him for me, end quote. And that's part of the evidence that there's also a letter about the transaction, that there's a letter between Philip Schuyler and Hamilton. There's 7 months between the letter and the cash book entry, but Sarah Filippi finds that to be normal for the time. And also, as we had noted earlier, Hamilton, as part of the slave trading, but not slave ownership, would purchase slaves in his own name and then transfer them to other people. So Sarah Filippi finds this different and is very clear that is her belief. There's also a cash book entry that says, quote, given to servants and others, end quote, an amount of $5. Now, to Ser Philippi, this proves that the word servant really means slave, because $5 to be divided amongst other people is way too low to be actual wages. That must prove that the people $5 went to were slaves, and that proves that the word servant really means slaves. And so every time we see anything in Hamilton's correspondence that says servant, it probably means slaves. Okay, now there's also evidence that Hamilton hired people who were enslaved by others to do work for him, and there's the tricky question of whether or not the wages you paid for such labor went to the people who performed them, the enslaved people, or whether or not they went to the people who were the slave owners. The exact quote is, quote, this woman notified Hamilton that her payment had gone to her former enslaver, and Hamilton then paid her directly for the work, end quote. And then Ser Philippi notes that there's only evidence that this happened once, an instance where Hamilton is clearly hiring somebody who's enslaved by somebody else, but when the wages that he pays for that work are siphoned off by the slave owner, Hamilton pays the enslaved person directly. The cash book also notes that some of the laborers are denoted as white. Hamilton would write the word white next to them, which probably means that if that's noted, there were also darker skinned people. And so if it doesn't say white, we presume that to be darker skinned. Okay. And now there is also on the flip side, and I realize I'm just kind of rattling through a bunch of different pieces of evidence here. We'll wrap this all up in a way that I hope summarizes pretty well. But before we get to that, there were censuses in 1790 and 1800, and they don't list any slaves for Hamilton or Hamilton's household. But Ser Philippi says, quote, the censuses themselves are not accurate, end quote, and then notes some problems with the census. Then, of course, Hamilton tragically dies in 1804 in the duel. His affairs have to be settled, and there are a couple different ways that his estate is assessed. There are people listed as, again, quote, servants with a value of 400 pounds, not dollars, so whatever the exchange rate was then. And there's probably 4 of them, but those people are listed as assets of the estate. Now, Hamilton didn't mention that in his own assessment of the estate, but other assessments do of the property and Hamilton's total property as, you know, he dies and all his accounts have to be closed and settled. Other assessments do. I will let Ser Philippi wrap it up, and you can tell Ser Philippi does not think any of this is okay. Quote, he was trusted by legal clients to know the ins and outs of the slave trade for certain cases. He was selected by friends and family to act as a financier and to purchase enslaved people for them. He purchased multiple enslaved people for his own family, and he did not leave instructions for them to be freed upon his death. The presence of these enslaved servants at his estate, the Grange, is confirmed by the value of Hamilton's estate, calculated after his death, likely by John Barker Church. In light of these primary sources, the majority of which are in Hamilton's own hand, it is vital that the myth of Hamilton as the abolitionist founding father end. These documents, especially when placed in context with each other, make it evident that Alexander Hamilton was an enslaver, end quote. Okay, that is one of the stronger cases that has been made to date that Hamilton was indeed a slave owner. Here's my take on Ser Philippi. Obviously a very smart person, obviously a very honest person sharing an opinion, and also providing evidence that is contrary to her own thesis. So when she comes across something, she doesn't hide it, she doesn't bury it, she does not fail to cite it, and she talks about it, which is intellectually honest. But I will say the overall tone and the style of argument, Ser Philippi is clearly arguing for a conclusion than just seeking to find the truth. Now, it's just a thing that happens, especially when you're doing historical research. You go in and you're trying to say, all right, I want to know the truth here, but somewhere along the way, you start putting the pieces together for yourself and you come to a conclusion. So I would say Ser Philippi is not being dishonest, but Ser Philippi sounds more like an advocate than an objective scholar through this. But having said all that, Ser Philippi is surely right about Hamilton's involvement in the slave trade. Yes, as a clerk and as a young person, Hamilton was definitely in a household that had slaves and definitely was part of a company that involved slave trading. Now, whether or not as an 11 or 12-year-old he was in a position to stop that is a separate question, but that was definitely a part of what he did. And then once he got to the United States and America, there is evidence that he still served as an agent in his role as a lawyer. He definitely performed work on behalf of people who owned slaves, and that involved, and at least a couple times, the use of slaves considered to be property. Okay, so those two things are certainly true. Now, it is probably true that there were enslaved people in his house. Sarah Philippi has made a case, and I'm going to review that in a sec, but I'm convinced that she is probably right. But the conclusions about how that traces to his overall stance as an abolitionist are utterly unsupported and not even reviewed. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So everything Sarah Philippi has to say about whether or not Hamilton was the legal owner of people who were considered slaves at the time, that's all objective. As soon as Sarah Philippi starts saying, and so that means he was never an abolitionist and there was nothing else to any policy that he ever did, Sarah Philippi isn't even talking about the other things that Hamilton did. So I think we, by the end of this episode, are going to know a little bit more than Sarah Philippi has presented in their paper. Okay, now I say probably owned slaves, so let's just review the case. If you think that the word servant means slave, and you think that the census was wrong, and if you think that some pay for labor is made to white people, so that must mean that some of the hiring is done to enslaved people. And part of that, keep in mind, is that when confronted with the idea that an owner sees the wages of this person called a servant, Hamilton then paid that enslaved person directly. That's part of the conclusion, that Hamilton was involved in hiring people who were enslaved to perform work, although he did probably try to directly compensate them. If those two things are true, and then if you think that when a purchase is recorded in a cash book and there's no client listed, that necessarily means the purchase was for Hamilton himself, and if you think his son and first biographer knew all about this and lied about it, which you wouldn't have had to do before the Civil War, right? If you said Alexander Hamilton owned slaves, that probably would not have been scandalous. If you believe all of those things, then Philippi's conclusion is perfectly reasonable. So I wouldn't say that I am fully convinced, but I do think that there is a plausible case that can be made that Hamilton was a slave owner. Now, Sarah Philippi does have a good point about how other biographers haven't been all that rigorous on this question, but to get Sarah Philippi's conclusion, you have to hold it up, kind of squint, change the focus a little bit, make some inferences about what the words there do mean, even though they're different than what they would currently mean. You have to decide that the things that say they weren't slaves were wrong and come up with the reason for that. And then you have to decide that the absence of other words, like if you say white, that must mean there's some words that mean black, or if I didn't put down who I made the transaction with, that must mean I did it for myself, okay? If you wanted to refute that, you certainly could. And I would say this is more an instance of the totality of evidence supporting Sarah Philippi's case and not so much a spoken gun. In legal terms, this is a lot more like there is quite a bit of circumstantial evidence, but there's not a DNA match to prove that Hamilton definitely, for sure, was the owner of people who were enslaved. Now, what I'd like to do before we move on, though, I think probably Hamilton owned slaves because of a bunch of evidence, which if you add it all together, probably points to that conclusion. But by contrast, if you were to say, what is the evidence that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner? Well, he owned a plantation. There were 100 slaves working there at any given time. He enslaved more than 600 people in his lifetime. There is literal DNA evidence linking him to Sally Hemings. No inference is necessary. You don't have to get his cash book and say, well, he didn't say who he made this transaction for here, so he must have made it for himself. It's just the evidence is clear, open, and in your face. George Washington, did he own slaves? Yeah, for sure. He inherited slaves from his father at the age of 11. We know that because of the will. There were 317 slaves in Mount Vernon in 1799, and Washington owned half of them. And that fact we know because there are a bunch of legal documents identifying which ones were considered to be his property and which were considered to be somebody else. His own will famously said that slaves on his estate should be emancipated, which can only happen if you have slaves. Hamilton did not have that clause, which Sarah Philippi says, well, that obviously means he was a mean guy who didn't free his enslaved people, didn't emancipate them. But the other possibility is they weren't enslaved in the first place. And in Washington's case, they for sure were. Okay, now we are going to get to the tensions around owning slaves, but being an abolitionist in just a minute. And everybody that I just listed is reputed to fall in this camp. If you're pro-Washington or pro-Jefferson or pro-Hamilton, you will all say they are abolitionists. They believe in abolitionism, even if they themselves own slaves or participate in the slave trade. But as far as whether someone owns slaves, the case for Hamilton is way thinner than it is for any of his contemporaries. If Sarah Philippi is right that Hamilton did, in fact, was a slave owner, that was far less conspicuous than the fact that Jefferson or Washington was, or any of the Southern slave owners who were fighting for to the continued existence of slavery in every single constitutional debate. So, what was Hamilton's involvement in slavery? It's definitely part of his business. It might have been part of his home, but it was certainly less prominent than it was for his contemporaries. So, how do we judge that? That gets us to part two of our inquiry here. How do we assess different levels of involvement in slavery for people living in the late 1700s? All right. Now, if you think it's black and white, and there is a strong case to be made that it is and that it should be, then that's all you need to know. All you need to know is that Hamilton was at least complicit in the slave trade, and if he probably owned slaves, that's enough. That condemns him as a human being and as a historical figure. We don't need to know anything else more about his life. If you don't think that, if you do think there are some gradations, or you are interested in the historical context of the time, or what it was like, what your stances could be if you were not an enslaved person, there are other possibilities. So let's just quickly review what those were. For the abolitionists, you wanted to eliminate the institution, free all the slaves, and don't worry so much about compensating the slave masters. If you took slaves, you had it illegally, any means necessary, get rid of slavery. And if it's all black and white, you just stop here. It's kind of John Brown or nothing. And in the play, in the musical, the guy who takes this position most obviously is named John Lawrence. And he famously had a plan to form a brigade of about 3,000 black soldiers. And the idea is that they would be granted emancipation in exchange for fighting against the British. This was supported by Hamilton, but never actually happened because the South Carolina delegation essentially argued against it. We'll talk about who that was in a little bit. But it's also worth noting that there are people who think John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton were so close that they might have been homosexual lovers. From what I can tell, the historical consensus is that John Lawrence was himself definitely bisexual and kind of a, supermodel. Lots of people found him sexy. And he and Hamilton exchanged some very intimate letters together. And I think it's worth noting. So John Lawrence, who's a really close friend of Alexander Hamilton, has this idea to create all black brigade in the Revolutionary Army. And one of the people who's in favor of it is Alexander Hamilton. Those are the abolitionists. All right. So as we move from that far left, right, we want to abolish slavery, which is, as we all know, the historically correct place to be. Standing next to them are the people who are in favor of manumission. Now that means you wanted to do something, you probably supported abolition. You were willing to use what was available to you until we got to full abolition. And one tool they had was to buy the freedom of people where they could, to oppose the return of escapees. If people did escape slavery, you were in favor of measures that would stop them from being returned, up to and including fighting them or giving them protection. And you wanted to enforce all the legal protections that were granted to somebody who was a slave. There weren't many, but it was not unlimited. And there were legal cases you could take up on behalf of people who were enslaved. So this group was more in favor of the incremental erosion of the institution of slavery, and usually for pragmatic rather than philosophical reasons, like it was when we think slavery is okay. It was more, we want to get rid of slavery, but we don't think we can win the abolitionist fight now. So what can we do? There was a New York group, the New York Manumission Society, who we'll introduce in more detail later on. But their platform was, we advocate for abolition, we advocate for humane treatment of people who are enslaved, and we establish a legal defense fund to prevent cruelty and to help escape slaves or people who were formerly enslaved with their legal matters. Okay, so we'll just pause and say there were both abolitionists and manumitionists who were definitely slave owners. These were people who privately had people who were enslaved to them, but publicly were advocates of abolition and publicly supported policies in favor of manumission. If that sounds like a nutso position to be in, that certainly is true looking back in history. They are all people who could have done more, and they were all people who were doing a lot more than their contemporaries. And so I think that's kind of where this group lands. And in a kind of tragic historical way, there were people there who were both slave owners, but also openly in favor of abolition. There were also those who opposed slavery, but didn't do anything about it, like Henry Lawrence. That is not John, so this is a different guy, same last name, but Henry Lawrence was one of the largest slave owners at the time, and he expressed private opposition to the institution of slavery. So there were definitely people who would say in private, sure, I'm opposed to it, but they never went publicly and did it. And two things separated the manumitionists and the abolitionists was they would go public and say, we are willing to renounce slavery. We are willing to commit to the humane treatment of people that are enslaved to us. And eventually they all called for that, if you were part of their society, you should emancipate all the people that were enslaved to you. So that as we move to the right, people are privately opposed but aren't doing anything about it. And then as you move farthest right, there are just the racist slave owners. And by God, there are plenty of them. They were the ones fighting for like the 3/5 compromise. They were people who were fighting to include slavery and not have it abolished in the Constitution. One of them, for example, was Charles Pinckney. He strongly argued for slavery. He was against voting rights or any other rights for slaves, but he wanted them counted in the census so that they would count for the U.S. seats, which is, openly hypocritical. He especially wanted the right to chase down escaped slaves that ran into free states. Okay. And this group might also include those who were indifferent, so not those who were active slave owners, but those who saw no problem with keeping other people enslaved. All right. So if there is a range of positions one can take on slavery in the late 1700s, that's sort of how they break down in very rough terms. Abolitionists who say abolition or nothing, manumitionists who say let's do whatever we can, and then it moves over to people who aren't willing to do anything or people who are active supporters of the institution. Okay, so we're now on part 3. So where does Hamilton fall in all this? How should we remember this guy? Well, let's start with some facts that go to what Alexander Hamilton was doing, apart from the question of whether or not he himself was the legal owner of people who were enslaved. Here I'm going to turn to Rob Weston. Weston's article was written in 1994. At the time, he was a graduate student in history at SUNY Buffalo. I think that he is now a lawyer, if I found the right guy on LinkedIn. It's been a while since 1994. I picked 1994 because that is pre the musicals. This is somebody who's just trying to interpret who the historical Hamilton is without all the baggage of the current popular debate. The publication that he's writing in, that Weston is writing in, is called Afro-Americans in New York Life and History. It's published in New York, of course. And I will say he is fully aware of all the things that Ser Filippi says that all the historians have ignored. So what is about to be ironic is that Ser Filippi, who's writing in the 2020s, is saying that everybody before, all these historians ignore things. But Weston, writing in 1994, so like 3 decades earlier, was not ignoring them, was acutely aware of them, but also had a bunch of facts that were presented in 1994 that Ser Filippi ignored, because Ser Filippi has no mention of any of these things as part of Hamilton's life. Ser Filippi merely says Hamilton, slave owner, and the story. Okay. He supported John Lawrence's proposal on the grounds of equality. So not just this is a good idea and would help us win the war, but I believe that people of color are equal to people with lighter skin. In 1785, he joined, the full name of it is the Society for the Promotion of the Manumission of Slaves, and was at the first meeting. It was the only anti-slavery group at the time that you could join in New York. This is 1785, so 15 years before the 1800s. He would later chair the Ways and Means Committee, and according to Michael Chan, who I will introduce later on, he was actually the second president of the firm and served as a counselor at law from 1798 until his death. So he's giving pro bono legal, he is big shot lawyer, and he's giving his pro bono work to this organization on behalf of people who are enslaved. And it all kind of works. They have lots of legislative wins. They are taking, remember, the incremental approach. That's what they believe in, but they win some incremental wins starting in 1785 all the way through 1799. This includes the establishment of schools for people of color. And in 1799, New York successfully passes the Manumissions Act, which was for gradual abolition. So it was essentially everybody, things like everybody born after that time was automatically free, and then ways that you could try to free as many of the people that were currently enslaved as possible. But that society, which is formed in 1785, and which Hamilton is a founding member and active member of, does successfully get legislation passed in 1799 that functionally abolishes it. Not immediately and not as fast as it should have been, but their incremental approach does eventually succeed in. According to Weston, Hamilton also spoke for equality during the 3/5 compromise debate. That was during the 3/5 compromise. Hamilton was pretty open about saying, look, these people of color are exactly equal to people with lighter skin. They are just in wretched circumstances. That was a position he took, and he took publicly. And in 1790, he became part of a group that signed a letter petitioning the New York State legislature for abolition. So that was before, by 1799, they had essentially won that as a more incremental thing. But in the 1790s, he was openly lending his name and support to the idea that abolition should happen. And I will say it is definitely the view. Now, one thing historians do not disagree on, it was definitely the view of Alexander Hamilton that the economic path forward required the end of slavery. Remember, he was the guy who believed in manufacturing and the mercantilist economy, and he did not like the agrarian economy, and he did not like how much slave labor was used in that agricultural economy. Okay, I'm going to just jump around to another couple authors that are not Weston, but our friend Chan says, during the Jay Treaty, there was a negotiation for the Jay Treaty that played in other ways in Hamilton's life. But part of that is during the Revolutionary War, the British had taken some slaves, they'd captured them and took them back to England after the war and gave them their freedom, which was great. Like, are you captured? I don't know. I'm free now. That's great. And Hamilton noticed, look, there's no way. And then there was a debate about, okay, so what happens? How do we negotiate where those people go after the end of the war? And Hamilton was like, look, man, if they've been granted freedom in the UK, there is no way we are going to bring them back to the United States and re-enslave them. And that treaty, the way it actually played out was complicated, and there was more to it than that, but that was definitely his position on what should happen to that group of people. Stephen F. Knott, who I will also introduce more fully, mentioned that Hamilton helped draft the Haitian Constitution of 1799, and he was an open supporter of Toussaint Louverture. Now, Haiti is kind of a big deal because it was a slave revolt. The slaves in Haiti revolted, and they won and established a country out of their slave rebellion. And depending on who you read, that's the only time that's happened in history. But at least it is one of the seminal, most important times that happened in history. Now, Hamilton's role is minor there, but there was serious opposition to what the United States was going to do at all. And of course, the Southern states were like, we are not going to support a slave revolution government because that will give the slaves in the United States an idea about what they should do. And Hamilton was like, not only do I support that guy who led the revolution, Toussaint Louverture, but I also am going to help them draft their constitution. And I think I mentioned this before, if you listen to the Revolutions podcast with Mike Duncan, it does a great job of covering all this stuff. And the Haitian Revolution is fascinating. And I learned a ton about that from his podcast. This isn't a paid endorsement. I just like it. He is a Seattle Mariners fan, but I'm willing to look past that. Okay, but as long as we are on the track of setting the record straight and talking about some historical facts, Aaron Burr was also in favor of abolishing slavery. He also advocated for women's rights and came at this weird juncture in history where his dad was one of the presidents, I think, of Princeton and a slave owner. Then Aaron Burr became both a slave owner and an abolitionist. And then his son was just an abolitionist. So as America was progressing, so was the Burr family. But interesting that whatever you think about Alexander Hamilton and slavery, is hard to separate him from Aaron Burr on that thing. Okay, so those are some facts about the political positions of Alexander Hamilton as they related to slavery. And as I mentioned, Sarah Filippi does not mention those at all, but all these authors were writing in the 1990s, so that information was available to Sarah Filippi. Why? I don't think really has much to do with the question of the slavery issue, but when Sarah Filippi says, and this just proves he was never an abolitionist, I don't think that's true, but more than that, it doesn't seem to even address the things that people point to say that maybe he was. Okay, so what do we make of all that? Well, let's divide this into people who think Hamilton definitely was an abolitionist, people who think it's a mixed record, and people who hate Alexander Hamilton's guts, starting with those who find the stance progressive. According to Weston, Hamilton spoke for equality on the 3/5 Compromise in the 1790s. He was part of the group who signed the letter petitioning the New York State legislature for abolition, and those are definitely pro-abolitionist stances. Michael D. Chan, who as of 2006 was working at the Claremont colleges, wrote an article in the Review of Politics in 1994. So that is 1994, decades before Hamilton the Musical comes out. Then goes on, I think at the time he was a graduate student when he wrote the paper, but became a professor at the Claremont colleges. He says other people, other commentators and other historians focus on how elitists Hamilton was, and what they miss was his deep commitment to abolition. So for other authors, Hamilton took part in the manumission effort, especially in New York. But for Michael Chan, that defined him, that he was definitely an abolitionist. And Chan has a long review of his political philosophy, which includes an extensive discussion of John Locke and how that related to freedom. Chan also thinks that part of Hamilton's advocacy for abolition was practical. Remember, he was a soldier and he wanted to win that war. And he knew, and the British were open about saying, hey, we are going to emancipate those slaves if we are victorious. And Hamilton saw this as a problem for winning the war, especially in the southern flank, that if you're going to try to win a war that is fought on land and uses, as at least adjacent to the civilian architecture, having a whole bunch of those civilians that want to have other side win is a problem for you. And so Hamilton, according to Chan, Hamilton is both philosophically opposed to slavery and strategically thinks it's a stupid idea to try to wage a war when you have a huge chunk of your population that's actively cheering for the other side. Chan says, and whatever you take of his philosophical stances and his pragmatic stances, ultimately his stance for a strong federal government is what resulted in the Northern victory in the Civil War. I'm going to quote Chan a little extensively here because he says it very well. Quote, Hamilton foretold the tendency of the doctrines advanced by Virginia and Kentucky to destroy the Constitution of the United States and set the precedent for using force to defend the Constitution when he called out federal troops to quell the Whiskey Rebellion. In sum, Hamilton's interpretation of the Constitution armed the federal government with ample power to put slavery on a path to extinction, even at the point of a bayonet, if necessary, end quote. And so what do you know Alexander Hamilton for? Well, in the very first episode, we talked about this. He wanted a strong federal government. And that Whiskey Rebellion is not exactly Hamilton's finest moment of pro-democracy advocacy, but it established the idea that the United States federal government could use military power to enforce the Constitution. And so if the southern states didn't like that and they wanted to keep slavery and that became unconstitutional, the reason that the federal government and the North was in such a good position to win the Civil War was because Hamilton helped establish the power of the federal government. And also, Chan points out his victory of commerce over the agrarian economy, like that part of the show where they're talking about, geez, Alexander Hamilton, your economic policies, we tried to get rid of them, but we couldn't, is accurate. And we devoted the whole second episode of this podcast to that. Look, man, Alexander Hamilton picked mercantilism and manufacturing over the agrarian economy. And that, as much as anything, led to the extinction of slavery. So what Chan has to say is he was philosophically opposed, he was practically opposed, and regardless of whether or not you think any of those things are true, the abolition of slavery can directly be linked to the two most significant things Alexander Hamilton did do, which is establish a strong federal government and get that central bank, which essentially favored manufacturing over the agrarian economy. Those two things, I think, led to the end of slavery. Now, I will say, Chan thinks Hamilton did not own slaves, and he cites one perfectly valid source to demonstrate that, but he also does not cite many of the other sources that were available at the time that says Hamilton did own slaves. Maybe if you think Sir Philippe's trying to argue a little more than just find the truth, I think Chan is also doing a little bit of that. He also thinks that Hamilton pushed too fast in the Manumission Society because what Chan believes is Hamilton always pushed for everything too hard, and it alienated a lot of people, including people that should be his allies. And he thinks he did that in the Manumission Society too. This is the opposite of what Weston believes. Weston thinks, look, if you look at Hamilton, if he was in favor of something, you had no trouble figuring it out. Like, he would push it as far as he could until he either got what he thought was the right thing or that he got kicked out of his own party and crashed and burned. And he didn't really do that with slavery. It is weird that Hamilton, like the hot-headed guy who never compromised, decided to take the incrementalist approach to the question of slavery. It would be a weird one-off for him. But I do think Chan is sort of in the minority of opinion on this question, that he thinks Hamilton definitely pushed too hard for the abolition and was an ardent abolitionist. And I think most people say he was an abolitionist, but this was not the way that he pushed for everything else. Okay, so those are the people who think unequivocally Alexander Hamilton, abolitionist, and definitely, as portrayed in the show, had he lived longer, he would have found people to work with that would have gotten emancipation happening faster than it did. There are those who give him mixed reviews. What Weston eventually concludes is that he fought for things that he really cared about, abolition was something that he was in favor of, but he didn't really fight for. He actually made a motion in front of the Manumission Society that all members should free their own slaves, although he himself did not. And Weston attributes it to his desire for prestige and acceptance. So Weston goes over a bunch of good facts, but ultimately, Weston's final conclusion is what Hamilton wanted was the acceptance. He was an outsider. He was not an aristocrat. He was unusual and knew it amongst the elite of the Revolutionary period. And so he could not get rid of slavery because that was too much part of being a prestige, being a gentleman, being the upper crust. I am not sure I agree with Weston about that. I mean, he trashed Jefferson, he trashed Adams, he trashed Burr. It is not entirely clear that he wanted acceptance. Even the people who don't like him thinks that he was prickly or he wasn't super compromising. You know, he'd also been the Secretary of the Treasury, was also Washington's best friend. He had already earned acceptance. Now, Weston thinks it's too complex for a simple judgment, and I agree with that. And he thinks that ultimately Hamilton has something to answer for on the question of slavery. So he says Hamilton definitely does something for slavery, but he's just not fighting as hard for that as he is for everything else. Stephen F. Knott, I mentioned earlier, is writing in 2018, so this is after the musical comes out. He's writing in a journal called American Political Thought, and Stephen F. Knott agrees that when Hamilton wants something, he went out and fought for it, and that abolition was clearly a second-tier priority for Hamilton. So Weston and Knott are on the same page of that. And then Benjamin Carp, writing in 2017, so kind of the same time that Knott is writing in the Journal of the Early Republic. Carp is a professor of history at Brooklyn, City of New York. He thinks that both the show and Chernow exaggerate the abolitionist credentials of Alexander Hamilton. Is he in favor of abolition? Yes. Is he as in favor of it as the show and Chernow say? No. The show kind of makes it seem that if only he'd lived longer, slavery would have been abolished sooner. And that is something that Carp just can't accept. So those are the list of people who give Hamilton mixed reviews. They say, yes, he did some stuff as an abolitionist, but no, that was not as successful doing that as he was, say, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And that to them is damning. That means it probably wasn't really a high priority for Hamilton. You knew when Alexander Hamilton was fighting for something, and he usually fought a lot harder than he did for abolitionists. So the third group of people are those who absolutely think Hamilton, they hate his guts. They think he was a slave owner, and that is disqualifying, and he was just a bad guy. So I've read the quotes from Sarah Filippi. Sarah Filippi, I think, is got good points about the probable slave ownership, or at least that raises things that are definitely should be talked about. But when Sarah Filippi says, and so he was obviously not an abolitionist, there's a whole bunch of facts that Sarah Filippi is just not talking about there. And there are, of course, obviously other people who hate his guts at the time. If you are a scholar of Thomas Jefferson and you really like Jefferson, you probably have found something wrong with Alexander Hamilton, and you probably don't think he was a great champion of abolition. In fact, if you're a pro-Jeffersonian, Jeffersonian is definitely the slave side of the question, way more than Hamilton is. And so for the people who do like Thomas Jefferson and don't like Alexander Hamilton, they tend not to give him high marks for his work abolishing slavery. Okay. And finally, Nancy Eisenberg in 2017 is writing in the Journal of the Early Republic. And she thinks that both Chernow and the show have made this guy look way more progressive than he actually is. He's more mad at the show than she is at Alexander Hamilton himself, but she's got plenty of poison for both of them. Here's a quote. Several scholars interested in the racial optics in Hamilton have argued that Miranda is erasing the history of slavery. I would take the argument one step further. He is erasing all power dynamics, race, gender, and class. Hamilton was no abolitionist, end quote. Okay, well, so you don't have to wonder too much about what Nancy Eisenberg thinks about Hamilton. She does not like him, and she does not like the fact that Miranda is portraying him as an abolitionist because she thinks he for sure was not. Now, at least in this article, Eisenberg does not cite Chan or Weston, although both were available, had been out there for decades. And she doesn't really comment about Lawrence and Lawrence's connection to Hamilton or Haiti and what Hamilton did there, or even what Hamilton did in the Manumission Society. Now, Eisenberg has published a lot, but I will say is a scholar of Aaron Burr. And I think, from what I can tell, is very honest and open and scholarly and correct about the life of Aaron Burr. But if you develop sympathies for Aaron Burr, or, if you're seeing the world if you're trying to take an objective look at the life of Aaron Burr and not getting yourself as deep into the life of Alexander Hamilton, it's probably not weird that you would come away thinking that Hamilton was no abolitionist. If there is stuff in Eisenberg's other work that does reference all of the work Hamilton did do, I'm not sure what it is. I've not really seen two sides to that. Like his work, the Manumission Society, he was part of the group, who was a founding part of the group, who was an active part of the group. He held leadership roles in the group. The group did want incremental change, and they were successful at doing that. Now, does that make him clean? No. But does that mean that you erase the history of slavery if you present him as being sympathetic to the abolitionist cause? I think maybe that is pushing it too far. Okay, we are now at the end. Here is my conclusion. I kind of fall in here with Knott and Weston. If you think it's black and white, all you need to know is that he was probably a slave owner, and that ends the story for you about Alexander Hamilton. If there aren't shades of gray, there's nothing to think about. But to me, it is obvious that he was not the same guy as Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson. There's evidence that he did what he could do to stem the abuses, and if only for economic reasons, he really, really believed in mercantilism over agriculture and did not believe in slavery. So failings in his personal life are evident, but publicly, and his public positions were consistently opposed to the abolition of slavery, because what he cared about more than anything else was economic policy. And that was contrary to slavery. I think it just does too much to say Alexander Hamilton did nothing worth considering in favor of the abolition of slavery. Kind of his whole life was dedicated to the creation of mercantilism and manufacturing, and he was acutely aware that was exactly at odds with slavery. Here's what Knott has to say, quote, "While acknowledging that he was no radical abolitionist, these actions nonetheless set him apart from Jefferson and Madison and will likely prove to bolster his reputation in a more diverse 21st century America," end quote. Oh my God, I hope you're right, Professor Knott. Let's just hope that we still have a diverse 21st century America. We're actively, of course, have a federal government that's now trying to eliminate all of those things. Ironically, probably using the power that it can trace to Alexander Hamilton. Anyway, I think diversity is here, whether we want it or not, and whether or not we want to acknowledge it or not. And I think Knott has a point there that, yes, you don't have to believe that Hamilton was a radical abolitionist to say he was not in the same class as Jefferson and Madison and was generally pushing in the right direction. So that's how I think we evaluate Hamilton the guy. How do we evaluate the show? Nancy Eisenberg would rather it not have happened. And I will say Miranda does simplify the slavery question. That there are, as we talked about earlier, there are a lot of critics of Alexander Hamilton. Those were the people that Nancy Eisenberg was talking about. And we will get to that choice of the race casting in the show. But almost everybody agrees that it's okay for, you can't take an 800-page book where a life as big as that of Alexander Hamilton and get every single little detail to be factually accurate. You can have some composite characters and summarize a bunch of things. The important thing is you get the big trends right. And I do think that Miranda does probably oversimplify the relationship of Hamilton to slavery. But I also think the critics of Hamilton oversimplify it a little bit too much too. Like for them, it's like, if we can take a bunch of evidence, which, there's pluses and minuses of, but if we evaluate every piece of evidence exactly the way we think it should be and don't consider any of the contrary evidence, that means Hamilton was definitely a slave owner. And so we put him in the same group as Thomas Jefferson and Pinckney of South Carolina. They were all, these great white founders who were all slave owners and therefore equal in our condemnation. I think that probably simplifies it too. Whether or not Alexander Hamilton personally owned slaves, the show, he was publicly pro-abolition, and the show is pro-abolition, as is just about everybody now, except for Stephen Miller and those creeps that still walk around in the KKK and feel more empowered these days. But take away that tiny little fractional minority, and everyone agrees, abolition, slavery is bad. The key is how the overall portrayal of the reimagined Hamilton plays into that current narrative. And I would say that the point isn't really that he was pure on the question of slavery, but he played a role in the slavery debate that was a net positive. I think what Hamilton really wants you to remember is that Hamilton's life was progressive. Like, he was really an immigrant. He really did make it good. He really did have some sympathies for the slavery abolition cause, and he didn't always get it right. But what Miranda wants you to remember are the parts of Hamilton's life that we can use right now. And those are remembering the part of him that was an immigrant, remembering the part of him that was willing to pay funds directly to the people that he hired to work with him who were enslaved by other people. And even when the enslaved people had already been paid and stole the wages from him, he's not all bad. And I think Miranda is totally okay with the idea that this is a flawed guy who made some mistakes, but there are lessons from his life that we need that are relevant to contemporary America. And that is really what I want you to take from the show. So let's remember that Hamilton was an immigrant. America needs to remember that, even if Hamilton was wrong about his subsequent immigration policies. Let's remember Hamilton was down with John Lawrence to form a regiment made of slaves and emancipate them all, even if his legislative track record on abolition subsequently was mixed. Let's remember that Hamilton backed the Haitian Revolution, formed the Manumission Society. If he made wrong choices along the way, let's remember that too, and not repeat those mistakes. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda would be cool with all of that. And I think he would say, if my show has raised all those issues and put them before us, and your point is there were things Hamilton did wrong, and you can prove it, that's the way history works. Right? Who tells your story? I've told mine, you tell yours. And when it's all done, what we should both take from the life of Alexander Hamilton is what are the good things we should bring forward and what are the bad things that we should leave behind. Let's remember the good, acknowledge the bad, learn the lessons, and help all that and use all that to help us make our own decisions better. All right. Alexander Hamilton and slavery, that is a sticky wicket. It made me, frankly, feel uncomfortable talking about it. I realize it's an uncomfortable thing for us all to be in, and I think that we need to have forthright discussions that are based on facts, and I think that that is the right way to move forward. I'll just say one more time that I think Miranda gets credit for raising those issues, and I do think it was right for people to raise the questions about slavery, and what we now need to do is, does that now ruin the show, change the show, do what? And I've shared with you my opinion. I hope there's something in there that has made your opinion a little deeper. Okay, up next, I have promised you I will never shy away for a ghost story. Now, sometimes those are obvious, like, say, T.S. Eliot, who wrote Cats, had repeated links to the occult and talked about demon possession all the time. Well, that's an easy place to go. Or say that Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Mis, had seances all the time. That's an obvious place to go. I will tell you this, you are not going to believe the ghost story we have about the life of Hamilton in the show Hamilton. It's not Hamilton himself. It is one of the central characters, though. And when I say you're not going to believe it, you are not going to, I could give you a million guesses and you would never come up with what the ghost story was. But I will say this, it was definitely one of the people who was front and center in the Revolutionary War. And they definitely thought that they were part of a supernatural event that was something that they were knee deep in. If I were to say, I'm just going to give away too much if I say anything more, but next time we will get to our ghost story, we will talk about the relationship of one of the central characters to the supernatural. Thank you for joining me today, and we are going to go stalking through the moors on the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.